Dean, the great advances of the 20th century were the revolution in relativity and quantum mechanics, gave us a whole new vision of what reality is. Through your prism of extrasensory perception, which, although controversial, I know you feel very strongly about, does that help you to see the potential of an even greater understanding of the physical world, even beyond the revolutions of the 20th century in the future?
I think so, but maybe in two ways. In one way, quantum mechanics tells us a lot about the nature of what might be thought of as elementary physical and energetic bits. So we don't know yet much how it scales up. I'm talking specifically about scaling up into chemistry, biology, psychology, maybe beyond that. What we can say, though, is that when we do an experiment involving interacting photons and create an entangled system, well, what's a photon? A photon's a hunk of electromagnetics. Well, every time my heart beats, it produces an electromagnetic pulse. Well, your heart's beating too. So when those two photons, low-frequency photons, interact, does that mean that we're entangled? Maybe. It's at an elementary level. It should be entangled in some way. So that's one part, is how does this move into the biological realm, and does it make a difference? There have been some theoretical studies looking at what would happen if an ant colony were entangled physically. And it turns out that it would be much more efficient than an ant colony that was not entangled because of the form of communication that could occur. This has given rise to something called quantum telepathy, which were actually pseudo-telepathy, a pseudo-telepathy paradigm, which says that if you took a group and used standard quantum mechanics and figured out what would happen if it actually was entangled, it turns out it is, from an evolutionary standpoint, a very efficient thing to have. So I can project forward, perhaps, to a time when we begin to look at the possibility of quantum mechanics changing our sense of what biology is all about. And then in another realm, is quantum mechanics, as we currently understand it, the final story? And I strongly suspect, just based on the history of development of ideas in science, that it is not the final development. In fact, in many ways, it can't be the final development, because until we can explain it all the way up to our conscious awareness, the game's not over yet. So I expect that we will have revolutions in the future which are equivalent to the quantum revolution. And
do you see a role for the potential mechanisms of what may cause ESP and any of its particular states that might help that along, or that might engender new thinking in that direction?
Yes, I suspect that the holistic fabric of reality, which is suggested by quantum entanglement, by non-locality in general, that suggests a new framework for how to think about ESP. So it's no longer some sort of mysterious powers that emanate from us. It's not signaling. It's not some kind of weird causal effects that we don't know how to connect, but more like correlations. They're simply correlations between macroscopic objects, namely us. If quantum mechanics, if the correlational aspect of it scales up in some way, in any way, to exist in biological systems, then we might be able to say, well, what would experience be like in that kind of environment?
It seems so strange to have such large macroscopic objects be subject to quantum mechanical effects in normal occurrence. Statistically, of course, anything can happen. This table can levitate, and that's a quantum mechanical possibility. But from the whole time in the history of the universe, the odds of that happening are vanishingly small. So it's hard to see how quantum mechanical effects would have that type of an effect on such macroscopic objects.
Well, that's because we're used to thinking of quantum mechanics as operating on elementary dead matter, little tiny things. But actually, do we know that it already works at the macroscopic scale? Sure we do. The experiments involving separation of photons are at macroscopic scales. There are experiments showing now a cubic centimeter of certain materials will show quantum properties in Bose-Einstein condensates. So I think we're not used yet to the idea that these effects actually do scale up. And in fact, if you think about this from the point of view of emergent properties of systems, elementary systems emerge into something more complicated and they keep emerging and eventually we emerge out of it. What's to make us think that the emergent doesn't continue up in this quantum scale as well? In which case, by the time it makes it to a biological system, it may not look very much anymore, like elementary entanglement, for example, but it may have properties like that or maybe even beyond that.
So what is the claim? Is it, certainly emergence is a critical aspect of the way the physical world is constructed, certainly in the biological world. Are you saying that quantum effects may have something to do with the emergent properties at different levels?
Yeah, I mean, biological systems have been proven in evolution to take really good advantage of anything that will help survival. So if it turns out that a pseudo-telepathy paradigm, which is based on a quantum effect, will make a tribe last longer than another tribe, then you can almost bet that somehow biology has figured out how to use it. So, but we won't see it in the same way that we see what happens in a physics lab. We might see it in the form of what we'd call ESP. See, because when it emerges, it gains new properties. It's like it becomes like smart telepathy or smart pseudo-telepathy, some other name that we'd have to come up with.
It certainly seems, though, that ESP's effect, if there's any at all, even you who support the reality of it, the effect is very small. It would seem to have almost no impact in ordinary life. Maybe on occasion some emotional experience, but very, very little impact, even for those who really believe in it strongly.
Possibly there's an inherent limitation. I mean, if we're really dealing with something like quantum holism, then it's very difficult to rip apart a piece of the holistic fabric and make it do something, because you can't do that. So we might be living simply in a medium that disallows very strong usage. On the other hand, you don't need much of an advantage from an evolutionary point to create a better survival. So maybe you only need a little tiny bit. Maybe you just need one member of the tribe to be the kind of the funny guy, the shaman, who has special abilities. And maybe they're not all that stable, even. And maybe they're sort of kept around by the tribe because they recognize that that's the one who occasionally gets the creative idea from who knows where that helps the entire tribe. So from an individual point of view, maybe it doesn't work so great. From a collective point of view, maybe it is actually necessary.
So in that case, the very small effect that ESP would have in its broadest sense would have isolated expressions that would have some step function benefit to the collective, and therefore get enhanced over generations in biology. That's the claim. That's
one way of thinking about it, yes. But I'm not convinced that ESP effects are always very small. So sometimes they're actually quite large. And it seems to be modulated by things like motivation and need. Most of the time, fortunately, in today's world, we don't need a lot. We're not always in life and death situations, in which case the modulation of this holistic fabric, if that's what's going on, is pretty mild. And so people experience ESP as something as mundane as, I know who's calling when I pick up the phone. It doesn't mean very much, but people report that a lot.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different explanations why that can occur. That person calls at about that time. One can get into endless.
All those explanations.
One can get into endless arguments about that, and I'm not interested in doing that because it's an endless street.
Right.
But what I am interested in is if there's anything real there, what the mechanisms for how this can occur, and what would that tell us about the structure of the physical world, if anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this emergent idea is an important one. So if quantum mechanics remains down at a level that describes only elementary particles and their interactions, it's useful. It's been estimated that quantum mechanics alone accounts for 30% of the world's economy.
Right, sure.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, eventually, like in any area of science, people begin to think of, well, what else is it good for? So if we start to figure out models that begin to emerge from elementary and further up into the psychological scale, maybe we'll discover new things that were completely unknown before.
And you think that ESP possibly is an accelerator to find those new models of reality?
I would say more that the ESP might be a reflection of the idea that we should go look for it. because maybe that's the way that it expresses itself in the psychological domain. And it may, in fact, if that's true, it must also be expressing itself in lots of other ways that we haven't begun to look for yet.
So it's a neon sign saying, look here, there's some interesting stuff here.
In exactly the same way that every anomaly that has occurred in science and somebody has pursued it long enough, they will find one of two things. They'll either find that it's absorbed by existing theories, or they'll find that it's cracking open a door into something that was completely unexpected. In this case, because of both the millennia-long anecdotal stories and the few century-long of empirical research, I would say that the neon sign blinking on the ESP is saying, this way for something interesting. We're not anywhere near to a final answer to it yet, but I think it is pointing for something that will eventually become quite interesting.